Lecture 2, Demonism, the Devil's Children and Evil Empires.
This lecture is going to be about the first of the three types of deviance theories, meta-theories, or organizational perspectives that we discussed. The first I called absolutist. And as I mentioned, absolutist ideology suggests that there is a universal set of norms that all people should engage in. The Ten Commandments, those of other religions, suggest that the universe is constructed in a certain way. The fabric of life is built on a certain set of immutable tenets. And those tenets are applicable to all people and all societies at all times. Demonism, which is what I'll call this first way of looking at the world, though I don't want to get hung up on the idea. I want to broaden this idea of demonism out to its most general sense and not get hung up on the term demon and its Christian background. Demonism takes that absolutist perspective and suggests that that which is wrong absolutely. That which is wrong has no modifying characteristics. We're going to start by looking at what I'm going to call classical demonism, the kind of demonism that goes back to the Middle Ages as the Western world's exemplar of demonism. Is usually most people think of the Inquisition and the Crusades and the Middle Ages, so we'll use that as our example. And I guess I should pause here also and make one other comment about the general nature of these theories as we begin to cover them. And that is, I will be talking about many different theories of deviance, but I will be tracing the Western world's, primarily, view of deviance. There are other cultures which have other theories. There are other intellectual traditions, such as in China. There's a long tradition of deviance studies with their own particular slants based on Chinese philosophy. So I think it's important just to mention that this is by no means a universal exploration of these theories. It comes from a particular intellectual tradition. The classical demonistic perspective is probably the oldest perspective we know of, in the sense that we credit classical demonism to what we call primitive, or nowadays you don't want to use that term because it's not politically correct, so pre-modern, pre-literate, pre-industrial cultures, whatever term you want to use for tribal cultures and hunter-gatherers and early agrarian cultures. We usually suggest that they had a demonistic view of deviance, though really that's quite a simplification and of the way they really thought about deviance. They were more complex than that. Excuse me, but they had almost universally a demonistic element to it, to what they believed. Classical demonism suggests that we look for the reasons that people act deviant in the realm of the supernatural. And I use the word supernatural very carefully, because I'm not just talking about God and the angels, and I'm not just talking about some kind of psychic phenomenon. When we use a term like good and evil, even if we don't have a theistic idea behind it, even if we're not coming from a very deeply religious background, when we talk about evil, what is the difference between a word like evil and a word like bad? Why do we use evil? What does the term evil add that a term bad or wrong does not encompass? The answer is a supernatural element. It may not even be God or something that's very articulated in the mind of the speaker, but we use the term evil rather than other terms because it brings in something that seems to be preternatural, something that seems to extend outside sociology, for example, into some other realm. Someone who's bad can be corrected. Someone who's evil has something fundamentally wrong with them at their core that wasn't probably part of their biology. We don't talk about evil genes yet. We may, if things go the way they're going now, we may eventually. But yet we don't talk about evil genes. So evil brings in a supernatural element to it, using the word supernatural advisedly. The demonistic perspective suggests that we look for the cause of deviance in some struggle. Almost all demonistic thinking involves a struggle between good and evil. There's a battleground. The world is a battleground. And in that battleground, one set of forces, which are the good forces battle another set of forces, which are the evil forces. It's encapsulated or reified, as we say in sociology, that is. The reification is when you take an abstract idea and speak about it as if it were a concrete entity. So the idea of evil is reified into God versus the devil. That's a reification of the struggle between good and evil. And this struggle of good and evil can be between the good gods and the bad gods, between the ancestors and the sorcerers. Every society may have its own take on it. Even in societies without a theistic belief, like Buddhism and other societies and other traditions, you have a demonistic element there, where what is evil or bad is perhaps going against the natural flow of the universe, the natural cycle of birth and rebirth, things like that. In the Judeo-Christian heritage, there's been an idea of a certain plan for the earth that God had created, and those who are trying to disrupt the plan. Evil in the Bible, for example, always stands as a temptation. It tempts you into bad thoughts. That's why eternal vigilance is so important. It's always there as a temptation. And sometimes, if it tries to tempt you and it can't, it will actually take possession of you. It has that power to enter your body and take it. That's how powerful evil can be. And then, of course, we need an exorcism. The demonistic perspective is powerful for many reasons. First of all, it has a positive trait that many other the theories we don't talk about don't have, which is that classical demonism, not its more modern form that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, but classical demonism really often saw the evil or bad acts of a person as beyond their control. That is, you didn't condemn that person. You tried to correct them. You tried to fix them. You tried to exorcise the devil. You tried to teach them the right way to live. Later on, that changed. So that was a positive thing about it. But there was also the negative side of that, which is that, and we'll talk about this in detail, deviance can spread. If it gets you, if it gets a foothold in your community, it can spread. And that's why evil, the devil, was so eradicated so strongly in times like the Middle Ages. But the other reason that it's so powerful is because it's a simplistic, dualistic perspective. If you break the world into good and evil, and you try to explain all deviance as a function of some set of evil forces, you've explained everything in your opinion. There's nothing that really else needs to be said. There is me, I am good. There is you, you are bad. We must struggle to the death. It's the story of every fairy tale, every fable, every cultural myth. It's the story of the Bible, in one sense or another, though it's much articulated and made complex there. It's the story of the temptations of evil. It's the stories of the golden calf. While Moses is up at the moment of triumph of the Hebrew Bible, he's up there getting the Ten Commandments, God's message to God. Evil triumphs down in the camp. So that opposition, you often see that opposition in the Bible. You often see, just at the moment of triumph, some tragedy, some temptation of evil. You have the flood. Noah's ark finally lands. Noah comes down. The first thing he does, he gets drunk, as probably all of us would after seeing the entire world destroyed. He goes to sleep. His son comes in and sees him naked. Noah, his other sons back in and cover him. Noah gets up. And the only words we ever hear Noah speak in the Bible, the only words he ever speaks, he's the silent hero of the Bible. The only words we ever hear him speak is cursing his son for having uncovered his nakedness and blessing the sons who walked in backwards as not to see his naked. So triumph, evil. Triumph, evil. We see that opposition all the children of Israel about to enter the land. Moses gets punished. He never gets to see the land. For everything he did wrong, he has to die. So there's always this opposition in the Bible. It's subtle there, but it's always there. Good and evil are always in some kind of a balance. In order to understand a more sociological perspective rather than a religious perspective on this, I want to cover some of the ideas of Peter Berger, who's a very well-known sociologist who discusses a number of these things. He wrote a book called The Sacred Canopy, and he makes an important point about the nature of the role of religion in society in its most subtle ways. And in it he says this: societies are artificial. Look around you. Besides your bodies, what around us here is not artificial, is not man-made. Everything here is man-made. Your clothes, your writing implements, this podium, everything. Go outside, look out one of the windows. Yes, you'll see a tree. That tree isn't there naturally. Someone put it there. We have created an artificial world, both materially and, more importantly, socially. That is, all of our social conventions, all of our ways of interacting with each other, all of our social institutions, our economic, political, they're all artificial. We made them. The problem is that we can't admit that, or at least historically, throughout most of history, we can't admit that. If we admit that our entire society is an artifice, that there's nothing here that is by some fundamental nature made, but rather is created by us, then we have to admit that all of society is subjective, that all of our institutions can be overturned, and therefore society at all points is subject to review and deconstruction. Most societies don't want to accept that. So what do? Peter Berger said what they do is create what he calls a nomos, N-O-M-O-S, which is the Greek word for law or piety, but it has a greater meaning than that. Because what it really refers to is what I call a sacralized social order. That is, it's an organizing principle of society, but one that is infused with the sense of the sacred. That is why he calls his book The Sacred Canopy. The nomos is a canopy over society. What it does is it says the following. This social order that we consider so artificial isn't artificial at all. It is the product of a plan of God, a plan of the laws of birth and rebirth, whatever the particular religious tradition is. And because of that, it is not only the way the world is, it is the way the world should be. And since this is the way the world should be, since it has a sense of sacredness in the way it is ordered, then the act of the deviant is not just an act of wrongness, but it is an affront to the sacred order of the universe. It is an affront to God himself, or whatever the deity is for that particular society. That is why the act of the deviant becomes so powerful, and why the act of the deviant is reacted to so strongly. In the nomos, in the sacred order, the way the world is taken for granted. The church is God's plan made manifest on earth. Defying the church is an act of defying God. There was no crime that was considered greater than the crime of heresy. You ask a person from the Middle Ages whether they'd rather be convicted of murder or heresy, they'll tell you murder in a minute. Because heresy came with it not only a physical punishment, but an excommunication from the church, an idea that your soul would burn in hell. Because heresy was a refutation of the sacred order of the world. Murder was a violation of a law. Heresy was a refutation or a renunciation of the entire nature of the accepted universe. And that is why also that rituals of public punishment were so important. Because public punishment reinforces the social order. Public punishment is a collective activity of reasserting the primacy of the nomos. You know, executions used to be public events. People would bring blankets, and they'd bring a picnic lunch, they'd bring their kids, they'd sit in front of the gallows. There wasn't television in those days, and this was entertainment. So they would come, and they would engage in a collective act of reinforcing their social order by demonstrating through punishment, through execution, their agreement that what this person had done was deserving of the ultimate punishment. More important than that, it was an attempt to purge the society. Which is why, by the way, public confession was so important. If you read the accounts of the Salem witchcraft trials here in the United States, you see that it was very, very important to the authorities that people confess. before they were executed. Some people have interpreted this as some kind of insecurity on the part of the judge that they were actually convicting people falsely. That wasn't it at all. They were sure what they were doing was right. The act of confession is an important public statement of reinforcing social mores. Because what the public confession is I did it and I was wrong. Here am I. This is what we call the subtext of the statement. That is, this is what it's communicating in its own way to the society. Here am I, a person who violated the nomos. Here I am, and I said through an act, or actually through speech in the case of a heretic, I said, our society is wrong. This artificial society we've created, it's wrong. And I'm going to show you it's wrong by doing something that is fundamentally opposed to the society. I'm calling into question the whole sacredness of the order of this society. Now it's time for me to be executed. And I say, I did it, I was wrong, mea culpa. And what I am saying then is, I, even at the moment of my own execution, am reasserting that you're right. The sacred order is the way it should be. I violated it. I will now be punished for that. But you weren't wrong to have it in the first place. The heretic that goes to death reconfirming their heresy calls into question the very basis of the society. Because they are saying you're wrong. All of this artificial nature of our society, I'm punching a hole in that set. I'm showing you that this is just a facade, that this is artificially constructed. And that's why the punishments could be so brutal. I mean, if you look at the punishments during the Inquisition, priests were taught very carefully, as part of their ritual duties, how to inflict the most amount of pain as possible. You had clerics whose jobs it was to torture, and they would go to seminaries to learn how to inflict the most painful torture that was possible. You had metaphorical punishments. They were very important. For example, you had people who were considered possessed by the devil. One of the things you would do would be to break every bone in their body. Every one, from the littlest to the biggest. Why? Because the devil has a hold of them. What does the devil have a hold of? Can't have a hold of muscle, can't have a hold of tissue. The devil's in there holding onto the bones. If you break every bone in their body, then the devil will have nothing to hold on to and he'll escape. Now, and he'll have to leave. Now, the devil may not be able to hold on if you break every bone in a person's body. But it seems to me that breaking every bone in a person's body has another subtext, as we say, which is, don't cross us or we'll break every bone in your body. So the devil excuse becomes another artifice, in a sense, a way to justify this kind of treatment and to demonstrate in a graphic fashion the power of the church. That is why other kinds of metaphorical punishments, by the way, were also important. The scarlet letter, a gossip might have dead fish tied around their neck for 3 days so that they had to show them how gossip stinks, or if they have a hot tongue, they may be dunked in water. The punishments that they had were metaphors for the things that they were supposed to have violated. And they were supposed to be public. The idea of punishing someone in private made no sense. Putting people in penitentiaries and sticking them up in a place that nobody wants to go to made no sense in those days. The whole purpose of punishment was to publicly demonstrate the violation. Historically speaking, the use of demonism had a historical consequence, which was that it put authority in the hands of a centralized church. Before that, you had a much greater, yes, you did have a pharaoh or someone like that. But what you had here now was not authority vested in a single individual, but authority vested in an institution. And that institution could exert that authority in the absence of any particular individual in that institution. The institution itself, the church held authority, not the Pope, and not the particular priest, but the church. If the Pope were to die, the church would still have it. If we were between popes, the church would still have the authority. Very different than a king in that sense. This was a step forward, some people say. It had to do with the advancement of society, the creation of strong, centralized institutions of authority, as opposed to kings. But it also had its negative side, which is before that, a lot of deviance was handled much more informally, through shame and humiliation and informal social control, as we call it. And here, for the first time, you had the centralization of power, which always leads to abuses of power, such as the Crusades and the Inquisition. This classical version of demonism that I've been talking about is still around today. We see it all the time. We see it in the Satanism scares that periodically reappear in this country in an almost faddish fashion. It's very big right now, but in the 1980s it was even a little bigger during the Reagan administration. And you had a lot of articles coming out. It was on the cover of certain magazines, and it was covered strongly in the news about Satanistic murders and ritual killings and animal sacrifices and cult brainwashing and all of these kinds of things. The abuse of heavy metal. I'm going to give one example to sort of try to understand the dynamic that goes behind this. In 1988 in northern Jersey, a teenage boy named Tom Sullivan, who was just a kind of slightly built small kid, stabbed his mother to death with multiple stabs from his Boy Scout knife, set his house on fire with his father and younger brother sleeping upstairs, and then slit his own throat. He left behind drawings of satanic images, the number 666 on the wall, which, as you probably know, is a sign from the New Testament of the devil. He had told his schoolmates that he was interested in starting a satanic cult. He listened to a lot of heavy metal music. He played the game Dungeons and Dragons, which has been very associated, if you know about it, with people who are into these kinds of cults. And many people in his community, including the police force and the religious community, decided that the reason that Tom Sullivan had killed his parents was because he was influenced by a satanic cult. And here was a kid who did very well in school, got good grades. He was studious, he was on sports teams, he did extracurricular things, he made money in the winter, going house to house, shoveling snow for the neighbors. He went to church. As a matter of fact, he had gone to church that very day. Now, how do you explain that? How do you explain a boy like that who found somewhere the anger to stab his mother 24 times? Must be supernatural, must be evil, must be Satan. And this isn't just a speculation. He said it was Satan. He left a message on the wall. Ladies and gentlemen, I did this because of Satan. I mean, not in those words, but he put 666 on the wall. He had talked about starting a cult. It was all very clear. Not only that, but in a nearby town in the same period, a number of vandals had destroyed homes, abandoned resort house, and it sprayed 666 on the wall and left a pentagram on the floor and other symbols. And the police were fearful that there were satanic cults starting in the area. They had found a dismembered goat a few years before, and they put all this together into some kind of movement. Next, couple weeks later, 700 townspeople met in the local high school to hear a Catholic priest and an anti-cult expert tell them how to tell whether the devil had influenced their children. One expert told parents, look, it doesn't even matter if Satan is real. It doesn't matter if you believe in Satan. If your children believe in it, that's what's important. Someone came and talked about how satanic belief is on the rise and how disaffected youth turn to Satan as a way to try to get power. A few weeks later, some enterprising newsmen who weren't going to take this at face value began to interview Tom's friends, and a totally different story emerged. They said that he had hated the school he was forced to go to by his parents, had told them so on many, many different occasions, hated it so much that he had begun to drink and begun to talk about how he could hurt his parents the most. And because his parents were daily churchgoers, because they were sending him to a Catholic school which he hated, he decided the worst thing he could possibly do to them was to claim a belief in Satan. And so he told his friends, why don't we start a satanic cult, and that'll really get our parents. So the question here is cause and effect. Did Satanism cause him to kill his parents? Or was a disaffection with his parents cause him to use Satanism as a excuse? He had started drinking heavily, which his parents had never mentioned, and he had told his friends that he planned to run away. In his friend's opinion, he was clearly more bedeviled by his family than he was by Satan. But this had a ripple effect throughout the country. For example, in Louisiana, the chief of police went to the library system and ordered, though it was never done and overturned in court, ordered the head librarian to give him the names of all people under 21 who had taken out a book on the occult. Clear violation of right to free speech. Why this concentration on Satanism? Why these stories? Why these apocryphal stories or real stories? I just happened to notice in the Philadelphia Inquirer just last week, Dallas jury gets case in which pair are accused of blinding their sisters. Down in Dallas, two sisters say their third sister was possessed by the devil, and they then claimed they didn't do it and claimed they were innocent, but the sister first told the police that her sisters had poked her eyes out in an attempt to try to release the devil from her. And as a matter of fact, the sister who was blinded didn't want her sisters prosecuted because she too believed she was possessed by the devil and believed that they did the right thing. So this kind of classical demonistic perspective, as opposed to modern demonism, which I'm going to discuss in just a moment, is still very, very much alive in our society. Why? Well, there are a number of reasons. First of all, it's convenient. It's convenient for the police, it's convenient for the parents, it's convenient for the prosecution, and it's convenient for the defense. The police, it explains a number of random different acts. If you can categorize brutal crimes that seemingly have no relationship under a rubric like Satanism, the way they do under a rubric like drug abuse, why are all these muggings? It's all drug abuse. Well, it isn't all drug abuse. But if you can call it all drug abuse, you've created a unifying idea that then explains all the violence. Get rid of drugs, you'll get rid of the muggings. Of course, there are plenty of people who mug who aren't drug addicts, but we like to use drug addicts as if everybody poor is a drug addict and use that as an excuse. Well, the same thing with Satanism. The problem isn't that this individual did something wrong. There's this bad force out in the universe that coerced. It's convenient for the public because it isn't the community's fault. Look, it isn't our fault that Tom Sullivan was so unhappy. It was his fault that he let Satan tempt him. It is convenient for trials. The prosecution uses it to emphasize how terrible the depraved criminal was. And, we all hate Satanism in this country. We're a good Christian country. And so evoking Satanism gives you that extra oomph that you might need to convict. And the defense can use it as an argument of diminished capacity. Look, anybody who would believe this stuff must have been crazy. Poor Tom Sullivan, yeah, he was dead, so there was never a trial. But if he had lived through this and hadn't slit his own throat, Tom Sullivan, it isn't his fault. Look, he got influenced by Satan. He needs counseling. It's different if you just say, look, he did it because he didn't like going to Catholic school. So, in the 1980s, one national writer wrote, and I'm quoting here, "A national epidemic of Satanist-related crime is growing faster than AIDS, even though the religious motivation is frequently deleted once the cases are actually brought to trial." So what he's arguing is there's a lot of Satanism out there. You don't see it in the courts that much because they get rid of it before it gets to the courts, like someone would try to hide Satanism. Of course, this kind of satanic movement probably has a lot more to do with the fact that how do you get back at your parents nowadays? Premarital sex, in the old days, that was the way you did it. Nowadays, that's not much. Drug use, all kids go through a drug experimenting phase. That's the conventional wisdom. So how do you really get back at your parents? Satan is one of the few things left for you. So if you're really angry and you want to go through that teenage rebellion in a big way, Satan is your best choice. Let's move now from this classical idea of demonism to a modern idea of demonism. Here we've got good and evil as secular concepts. That is, they're not directly tied into God. Sometimes they are, if you look at the televangelists. But people talk about good and evil nowadays, and they don't necessarily mean this very overt theistic kind of good and evil. It's more subtler, more secular good and evil. As I said, the supernatural element is still in it. But they don't think of it that way necessarily. God doesn't need to be present in modern demonism. What needs to be present is some sort of idea that there's a fundamental badness, a fundamental wrongness, a split of the world into those who see what's right and those who don't, the chosen and the rejected, the superior and the inferior, actually. It's how it ends up falling out. We've got a lot of examples of that in modern society. Certainly we've got the religious right, which is the most obvious example, and I'll talk about them more in a moment. But we've got a subtler kind of demonism. Ronald Reagan gets elected in 1980, gets up in his inaugural speech and talks about the evil empire across the sea. Not the politically depraved empire, not the empire that violates human rights, not the military machine that wants to spread communism, but the evil empire. That word was not randomly chosen. That word was meant to communicate a set of ideas. It was meant to tie the Soviet Union into a history of ideas that have a strong historical background in our society. We can look at the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad, who was the founder of the Nation of Islam, said, "White man is the devil." Can't get much clearer than that. A clear demonistic point of view. And even Farrakhan and other more modern spokesmen, if they aren't specifically saying the white man is the devil, are using highly demonistic thinking. And of course the same is true on the other side. You look at the white supremacists. They say exactly the same thing. Not always in public. They've finally learned after about 50 years to polish their public image and not say what they really think in public. But for people who have infiltrated these places in private, there is a highly demonistic kind of thinking going on there, mixed in with a pathological thinking that we're going to talk about in the next lecture. And the two of them together are the worst combination you can possibly have in a society. Have led to more horror than just about any other way of looking at the world. A demonistic perspective and a pathological perspective put together. But I'll talk about that in the next lecture. We also see other kinds of subtle ways in which this happens through movements against rock music, particularly heavy metal music, but other music in which people claim that it influences teenagers to commit suicide. It influences teenagers to do bad things. People spend whole careers playing records backwards, looking for the devil and other words in these records that they think are subtly being sent to their children. Of course, part of the problem of that is that every psychological test ever done where people have actually put words in music going backwards, and then they've tested to see if there's any knowledge consciously or even subconsciously of these words, the answer is no. Your brain doesn't automatically turn music backwards and look for words. But it doesn't matter. People still look for them in these albums. Another example, of course, is AIDS and homosexuals. Homosexuals were demonized. They'd always been demonized. They still are in some circles, but AIDS was what you were looking for. I mean, this was the plague that God promised to destroy evil. This was the 10 plagues in the Bible. This was the proof of the evilness of homosexual activity. There have been movements to ban certain types of art, often using an evil, and rock music is a good example. In 1982, the California State Legislature, one legislator, introduced music to ban certain rock music as satanically inspired. And that was in the bill. It was defeated. And of course, we see a lot of this kind of talk around the abortion issue. And we also see it on the other side, by the way. It isn't just on the right side. There's that kind of talk on the left. Liberation theology in Latin America is a mixture of Christianity and communism. And it's very, very demonistic in the way in which it portrays the wealthy, and the poor are the chosen people, and the people who run the society are the devil incarnate. So we see it a lot. It is a wonderful system to evoke, to make a clear point about who your enemy is and why your enemy needs to be overturned. The extent and power of demonistic thinking in our society is easy to underestimate. Because when we think about it, we tend to focus on the religious right and their 40 major television networks and their hundreds and hundreds of radio shows and their enormous amount of power, and Oral Roberts saying, God has told me that if I don't raise $8 million by the end of the month, he will take me back, and then immediately getting the money by the deadline, lucky for him, I suppose. Pat Robertson actually running for president and having a very respectable showing in this country. And I don't want to get into a critique of the religious right and things like selective citation of the Bible. They're really not fundamentally different than any demonistic group, in that once you create a clear and bifurcated, split into two parts, bifurcated portrayal of the world, there's nothing else need be said. You look at some new religious movements, Unification Church. You look at Meher Baba, for example, which is a smaller sect. And some of the other sects, you have two types of new religious movements. This is what we sociologists now call what used to be called cults, because we don't want to use the word cult anymore because it has a pejorative public meaning, so we create new words. This is part of the way professions develop. You create new words for terms that you can't use the popular term for anymore. And sometimes it's silly and sometimes it's important, because when a sociologist talks about a new religious form, they're not necessarily condemning it. When you talk about a cult, you're condemning it. The new religious forms, there are certain new religious forms that are dualistic in their nature. That is, they're new religions that create good and evil. The Branch Davidians were a dualistic cult. The Moonies are a dualistic cult, the Unification Church. Then you have other ones like Meher Baba, which are not dualistic. They see the whole world as a one great illusion that one has to get behind, but there isn't an in-group and an out-group. Still, demonistic thinking is very, very prevalent in those kinds of groups, in many, many different esoteric religious groups. Demonism is a comfortable, easy way to view the world. It inhabits all of our thought to some degree or another. We're all demonistic thinkers. We all, to some degree or another, believe deep down that some people are bad. I don't know how many of you remember a couple of years ago there was something called the Wilding in Central Park in New York. What happened was a group of youths rampaged through the park. There was the famous case in that particular incident was a jogger, a female jogger who was running through the park, and she was beaten and raped by a group of these youths and beaten severely, and she ended up living and testifying at their trial, though she has never fully recovered in terms of getting all of her faculties back. She was beaten pretty severely in the head. And immediately there was the normal soul searching that our country does around these things, and people were shocked to find out that these kids were not lower class ethnic minorities. These were there were some ethnic minorities involved, Hispanic, but they were middle class kids. And so immediately other kinds of explanations began to come into the fray, and shortly thereafter Edwin Yoder, who writes a syndicated column, wrote a column in which he said, "I am tired of sociobabble." He said, "I'm tired of all of these people writing and say, look, they came from minority backgrounds, they came from socioeconomically deprived backgrounds." He said, "I'm tired of all of that. These kids were evil. And it's about time we stopped mincing words and making excuses and we talked about evil." So I wrote back and I said, look, let's say Edwin Yoder is right. First of all, his interpretation of sociology is wrong because sociologists don't use these explanations as excuses. Just because they came from a depraved background, if they did, may help us understand why more poor kids do these things than wealthy kids, but it doesn't excuse them. Don't conflate explanation and excuse. But even more important, let's take your idea, Edwin, and say they're evil. Now, what do we know about them now that we didn't know about them before? What explanatory power does the term evil add to our understanding of what they did? Knowing that they're evil, what should we do differently? And the answer is, the term evil doesn't tell us much. It doesn't help us much. It doesn't add explanatory power to what we want to know. If we take it for granted that people that do horrible things are evil, fine. Now what? So are the poor more evil than the wealthy? Are minorities more evil than majorities? Do people get more evil in times of economic depression when crime goes up? Is America, which has a higher crime rate, more evil than Japan, which has a lower crime rate? Did the Soviet Union become more evil in the fall of communism when its official crime statistics started going up? I mean, the term evil doesn't tell us a lot of the things we need to know about social policy to try to create responses to this kind of crime. Not only that, but it glosses over all the subtlety of behavior. At the Salem witchcraft trial, people were put to death. 20-something people died. Another couple hundred were in jails before the whole thing broke and fell apart. Were they really about witchcraft? Were they really about evil? Not at all. Every person who's ever written about them has said this was about social conflict and this was about the role of women. As a matter of fact, articles about the history of witchcraft emphasize that though witchcraft is supposed to be equally performed by men and women, over 80% of the people ever put to death for witchcraft were women. Witchcraft became a way to control uppity females in history. Women who broke the nomos, who violated the nomos. So, do we understand more about witchcraft by looking into evil, or about trying to understand the social processes that created it? On the other hand, there is something about demonism that sociologists can learn from. And I think sociologists ignore the criticisms that come from people who take this point of view at their peril. Because what you do end up having very often in social sciences is a relinquishing of moral responsibility. That is, you do get courses in deviance where the term evil is never mentioned. If you look in most textbooks and you look up demonism or evil in the index, you won't find it. There are a few exceptions. But evil, how can you write a textbook about murder and rape and arson and never talk about badness? So there must be some sort of compromise. There must be some sort of understanding. The idea of evil, the idea of badness, the idea of moral condemnation should not be absent from the discussion. But it needs to be put to the side. Perhaps another way to put it is, sociology doesn't have, within its context, a good way to categorize this particular social label. It must acknowledge it, must recognize it. But that isn't our strength. I say here in parentheses, however, that there's a whole study of the sociology of evil, which is fascinating, and which explains all the sociological underpinnings of who's considered evil in what society and at what time. And that can be quite fascinating. But still, even with that caveat, evil is not the realm of sociology particularly. What sociology can say about demonism is that it is a social construct that allows certain groups to express power through the use of a label that has a long history and a lot of implications. And then what the sociologist must do is say, where does this power come from? What created this power? How is the term evil used by social institutions differentially? Why are some groups evil and some acts evil? Why is it evil when Tom Sullivan kills his parents? But it is not evil when the executives of the Ford Motor Company find out from their engineers that in the design of the Pinto, the gas tank is going to explode in a certain number of rear impacts, and then call in their accountants and say, what will be the cost of settling the lawsuits against us versus the cost of retooling the Pinto, and find out that the cost of the lawsuits is less and decide to let people die. You don't see a lot of talk about that kind of evil, because evil is used against lower classes. Evil is used against a certain group. Sociologically speaking, evil becomes another tool of a society to differentiate between those it wants to label evil and those that it wants to excuse.